Welcome to The Debate. Right now, billions of us are carrying a public square in our pockets.
Yeah, quite literally.
Right. A space with no cobblestones, no borders, and no single jurisdiction. So the question is, did we just democratize human voice, or did we engineer a trap?
That is the big question.
Exactly. Today, we are exploring the profound tension surrounding social media, and we're drawing heavily on the analysis presented in The Digital Double-Edged Sword. We are examining a technology that serves as well both a liberating tool and a potential engine for societal harm.
It's a massive contradiction.
It really is. So the central question we must grapple with today is whether social media is at its core a force for unprecedented global connectivity, or if its foundational architecture inherently operates as a public menace that destabilizes civil discourse.
What? And to frame where we're starting from today, my position is that social media's reliance on engagement-driven algorithms actively amplifies extremism and erodes public trust.
And I'll state my position clearly right up front. I argue that social media is a free platform that empowers individuals economically and politically by, bypassing traditional gatekeepers.
Well, I think we have our lines drawn.
We certainly do. Let's lay out our initial perspectives here. When I look at the landscape of social media, I see an unparalleled leap forward in human capability. We have to acknowledge the baseline reality of this connectivity.
Sure, the connectivity is there.
Right. These platforms bridge global divides in a way that previous generations couldn't even conceptualize. We are looking at technologies that allow people to maintain intimate relationships across vast geographical distances. And, perhaps more importantly, they mobilize critical social movements that would have been suffocated in their infancy just 20 years ago.
I see your point on mobilization, definitely.
Yeah, because the core of my argument rests on the democratization of voice. For the entirety of human history, mass communication required immense capital. You needed a printing press, or a broadcasting tower, or a major publishing house.
The old gatekeepers.
Exactly. Individuals needed approval from a very small, very elite group of media gatekeepers just to be heard. Social media completely obliterated that barrier. Anyone with a smartphone can now speak directly to the world. Furthermore, we really cannot ignore the economic reality. These platforms function as the engine for the creator economy. They drive livelihoods, fostering entirely new business models and microeconomies that empower individuals to bypass corporate hierarchies and build independent wealth. So to me, it is a massive shift of political and economic power back into the hands of the individual.
I come at it from a different way. While the narrative of empowerment is appealing, it ignores the mechanical reality of how these platforms actually operate under the hood.
How so?
Well, the internet we were promised in the 1990s was a democratic utopia, right? But the social media we have today is built entirely on surveillance capitalism.
Okay, but it still allows people to speak.
You mentioned the ability to speak, yes, but the platforms do not merely host speech. They mathematically sort, amplify, and suppress it based on a very specific set of corporate incentives. Because the algorithms are engagement-driven, they inherently prioritize human attention over truth.
They prioritize what people want to see.
But this is not a neutral public square. It is a highly engineered environment designed to extract behavioral data for profit. And the mechanism for keeping people on the platform, the most efficient way you maximize those engagement metrics, is by triggering outrage, fear, and tribalism.
That's a pretty dark view of human interaction.
It's the reality of the data. This foundation actively amplifies extremist content and polarizing rhetoric simply because those emotions keep users glued to the screen. They capture our psychological vulnerabilities. So the empowerment you describe is, in my view, an illusion that masks a system actively degrading our cognitive autonomy.
Well, when I look at this so-called illusion, I don't see confinement at all. I see the removal of the biggest bottleneck in human history.
The editorial bottleneck.
Yes. You argue that the algorithmic sorting degrades civic cohesion, but I look at the removal of traditional gatekeepers as the most vital component of true free expression. Think about the era of 3 major television networks, right?
Sure, the broadcast era.
When you have a handful of network executives or newspaper editors deciding what is newsworthy, you have a systemic bias that historically silenced marginalized voices. The ability to bypass that editorial bottleneck is inherently democratic. It allows ground-up narratives to form without needing permission from the elite.
But bypassing gatekeepers doesn't mean we remove the gate entirely. We just replaced human editors who had at least a nominal commitment to journalistic ethics or community standards with a profit-maximizing algorithm.
I wouldn't say human editors were always purely ethical.
Maybe not perfectly, but by acting as rapid distribution channels without any friction or oversight, these networks allow unverified health data, political conspiracies, and outright fabrications to spread instantly. We saw this extensively documented in the source material regarding global public health crises.
That's true. The source material does highlight that rapid spread.
Right. A democracy requires us to at least agree on a shared set of facts. If the code fractures reality so that your feed says a virus is a hoax and my feed says it's an apocalypse, we don't have a public square anymore. We have two completely separate realities.
But isn't that just a difference of opinion?
It's deeper than opinion. When unverified information travels at the speed of light, it actively erodes trust in scientific and democratic institutions.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because we have historical precedent for this exact type of disruption. Consider the invention of the printing press.
Okay, taking it back a few centuries.
Yeah, well, before Gutenberg, the gatekeepers of truth were the monarchies and the church. They held a complete monopoly on information. When the printing press arrived, it didn't just print Bibles. It printed heresy, unverified pamphlets, witchcraft manuals, and radical political treatises.
Which led to massive wars.
Exactly. It caused massive social upheavals, centuries of conflict, frankly. But would anyone argue today that we should have kept the monopoly on truth in the hands of the elite just to prevent the spread of bad pamphlets?
No, obviously not.
The initial chaos of democratized information was a necessary, albeit painful, transition. The ultimate widespread access to information was a net positive for humanity. Social media is our modern printing press, and we are simply living through the messy transition period where society is learning how to read the new pamphlets.
That is a fascinating analogy, but it falls apart when you look at the mechanism of distribution. The printing press produced static documents.
Static, yes, but highly influential.
True, but a person had to read it, interpret it, physically carry it to a tavern, and hand it to someone else. The friction of physical reality slowed it down, allowing time for rebuttal and contemplation. Social media possesses an algorithmic sorting mechanism that the printing press never had.
I'll grant you the speed is fundamentally different.
It's not just speed. The printing press didn't actively monitor the reader's eye movements, determine that they felt angry, and immediately feed them 10 more pamphlets specifically designed to escalate that anger just to keep them reading.
Well, a sensationalist publisher might try.
But they couldn't do it in real time. The issue here isn't the democratization of creation. It is the weaponization of distribution. The technology isn't just handing you a flyer. It's studying your psychological reactions in real time to decide which flyer will trigger you most effectively.
But let's think about the person actually on the receiving end of that distribution. You focus on the absolute worst-case scenarios of political disinformation, but the vast majority of social media use is profoundly personal.
Is it, though?
Yes, absolutely. This weaponized distribution you're warning about doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens to individual users seeking connection. When a teenager with a rare disease finds a global support network, or a marginalized individual in an oppressive regime finds their tribe, isn't that worth the friction?
I'm not denying those connections happen.
But they are fundamental to the platform's value. The unprecedented connectivity these platforms provide allows people to find communities they would never, ever find in their physical geography. That is a staggering achievement for human well-being.
It is a remarkable achievement until we examine the specific mechanics of how that connection is sustained. I want to shift the focus from the act of connecting to the architecture of the platform itself.
Okay, the architecture.
Specifically, the metrics-driven nature of likes, shares, and retweets. We aren't just connecting, we are quantifying social approval in real time.
People have always sought social approval?
But not like this. Anyone listening to this right now has felt that pull, that unconscious muscle memory of opening an app just to refresh a feed, hoping for a notification. That's not a moral failing on the user's part. That's deliberate engineering.
You're typing about the gamification aspect.
Exactly. This gamification of human interaction is precisely what destabilizes mental health. When your social worth is reduced to a public, algorithmic metric, it creates a deeply fragile psychological state, particularly in developing minds.
Which is a valid concern for teenagers, certainly.
We are talking about severe self-esteem issues, the fostering of airtight echo chambers, and the facilitation of cyberbullying at an unprecedented scale. We are seeing a direct correlation between this environment and a crisis in mental health, which ultimately bleeds out and destabilizes our broader civil discourse.
I acknowledge the reality of cyberbullying, and I certainly don't dismiss the very real mental health challenges you're pointing to, but I have to challenge you on the locus of responsibility here.
You think it's on the user?
Is the blame strictly with the algorithms, or are we simply witnessing individual human habits and societal flaws being laid bare on a digital stage? People have always sought social validation. Clicks, bullying, echo chambers, these existed long before the internet.
They did, but not at this scale or velocity.
Are we perhaps blaming the mirror for the reflection? If a user chooses to endlessly scroll through negative content, or if teenagers engage in exclusionary behavior online, that seems to me a failure of individual habit and social education. We need to teach digital literacy rather than pointing to a fundamental flaw in the concept of connectivity itself.
It is not merely a mirror if the mirror is designed as a funhouse.
A funhouse?
Yes. The algorithm actively shapes the behavior. It doesn't just reflect our desires, it exploits our psychological vulnerabilities to keep us engaged. The variable reward schedule of pulling down a feed to refresh it is neurologically identical to pulling the lever on a slot machine.
That's a strong comparison.
But it's accurate. Sometimes you get a reward, a like, an interesting post, and sometimes you don't. That unpredictability is what hooks the brain's dopamine pathways. That isn't a reflection of human nature. That is the deliberate exploitation of human nature by software engineers.
And why do you think they do that?
Which brings us directly to the foundational business model. If they are engineering our attention, they are monetizing our attention.
Yes, and that monetization is exactly what drives the economic engine I mentioned earlier.
The creator economy.
Exactly. The creator economy is a massive paradigm shift. Millions of independent creators, artists, educators, and small business owners can now monetize their skills directly to an audience.
But they are entirely dependent on the algorithm.
Historically, if you wanted to make a living creatively or intellectually, you needed a massive marketing budget or a corporate sponsor. Now, the platforms provide the infrastructure for micro-entrepreneurs to thrive. They don't need a traditional employer.
I see the appeal, but
It creates entirely new business opportunities that literally did not exist a decade ago. It is a profound democratization of capital. People are paying their mortgages and funding their art through these networks.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
All right.
That entire creator economy is a secondary byproduct of a system rooted entirely in surveillance capitalism. The economic value you are praising is generated through the non-consensual extraction of human experience.
I wouldn't call it non-consensual. Users agree to terms of service.
Nobody reads a 50-page legal document before looking at photos of their grandchildren. You argue that creators are being empowered, but in reality, they are merely tenant farmers on algorithmic land. The platforms extract what we call behavioral surplus from billions of users.
Behavioral surplus?
Yes. They aren't just selling your basic demographics. They are taking the milliseconds you hover over a photo of an ex or the time you stop scrolling to read a political headline, bundling that immense psychological profile and selling the certainty of your future behavior to advertisers.
That's the advertising model. It's not inherently evil.
The economic benefits to a fraction of users do not justify an architecture designed to extract attention at the absolute cost of civil discourse. In this model, the user is not the customer. The user is the raw material.
But that raw material exchange is, in fact, a consensual trade-off. Users are not blind to the fact that there are advertisements.
They might not understand the depth of the tracking, though.
They receive a tremendously powerful free service, global video calling, instant messaging, endless entertainment, and business infrastructure in exchange for targeted advertising. We can debate the parameters of the data collection, but to frame it as purely extractive ignores the tangible, daily utility the platforms provide to billions of people.
It's a high price for utility.
The creator economy isn't an illusion. It is a very real transfer of wealth to independent operators. However, acknowledging the massive scale and impact of the system brings us to the most critical juncture of our discussion. How do we govern it?
Regulation.
Because both of us agree, based on the source material, that social media transcends pure economic value. It is too deeply intertwined with our political and social lives to be viewed simply as a marketplace. The question is how to manage a private space that functions as a public utility.
Exactly. And the material is clear that relying purely on voluntary self-regulation by tech monopolies has completely failed.
Well, it's struggled, certainly.
We cannot expect corporations whose primary fiduciary duty is to maximize user engagement to voluntarily suppress the very mechanisms that generate their revenue. If outrage drives profit, they will not turn off the outrage machine voluntarily.
But moving away from voluntary self-regulation is fraught with peril. When you introduce external regulation, specifically state regulation, you immediately run into the threat of censorship.
It doesn't have to be censorship.
The free platform model relies entirely on the absence of a central authority dictating what can and cannot be said. If we mandate by law that platforms must police disinformation, we are effectively asking them to establish a ministry of truth.
That's a bit hyperbolic.
Or worse, we are asking the government to dictate speech parameters to private companies. That threatens the very core of the democratization of voice we've achieved. If the state decides what is true, marginalized voices will once again be the first to be silenced.
We don't need a ministry of truth to regulate the mechanics of the platforms. The global discourse is increasingly exploring systemic frameworks that don't regulate content, but regulate conduct and design.
Regulate the design?
Yes. Take the European Union's Digital Services Act, for example. It forces platforms to assess and mitigate the systemic risks their algorithms pose to society, including impacts on mental health and civic discourse. It demands systemic accountability.
But who defines a systemic risk?
Think of it less like content moderation playing an endless game of whack-a-mole with bad posts, and more like product liability. If a car company builds a vehicle with faulty brakes, we don't blame the driver when it crashes. We hold the manufacturer liable for a defective design.
Okay, I follow the analogy.
The algorithms are the brakes. You cannot balance free speech with accountability without addressing the algorithmic amplifiers. We have to decouple the fundamental right to speak from the algorithmic entitlement to be artificially amplified to millions of people.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently.
Go on.
I agree that systemic accountability is necessary, but I believe algorithmic transparency is a far better, far more sustainable solution than heavy-handed state regulation like the Digital Services Act, which carries massive risks of bureaucratic overreach.
Transparency is just a buzzword if it doesn't have teeth.
Transparency means prying open the black box. If independent researchers, everyday users, and civil society can see exactly how the engagement metrics are weighted, if we can see exactly why a specific post was pushed to our feed, then the market and the public can make informed decisions.
Relying on the market again?
It empowers the user to adjust their individual habits and demands accountability through public pressure. It treats the user as an adult, capable of making choices, without requiring a centralized state apparatus to declare what constitutes a systemic risk.
Transparency is a prerequisite, absolutely. We cannot regulate what we cannot see. And opening the black box is step one. But transparency alone assumes a perfectly rational user base that has the time, energy, and technical expertise to audit complex machine learning models every time they log in.
They don't have to audit it personally. Watchdogs would do that.
Even so, knowing that the slot machine is rigged doesn't stop the gambling addict from pulling the lever. The transparency metrics proposed in these new frameworks are vital, but they must be paired with structural limitations on surveillance capitalism itself.
You're asking to tear down the entire business model.
If the business model remains extractive and the algorithms remain legally permitted to optimize for addiction, then transparency just allows us to watch the erosion of our democratic institutions in high definition. We need actual guardrails on the design.
Well, as we look to synthesize our positions, I return to my central thesis. Social media, despite its profound and undeniable flaws, functions as a free platform. The unparalleled connectivity, the democratization of voice that shatters historical monopolies on information, and the economic empowerment of the creator economy represent a massive leap forward for individual liberty.
Even with the fallout.
The challenges we face, misinformation, echo chambers, the gamification of our social approval are significant, but they are the messy growing pains of a hyper-connected society learning to wield a new tool. I maintain that these issues can be mitigated as individual digital literacy evolves and matures, coupled with rigorous algorithmic transparency, rather than dismantling the system's core freedoms through heavy state intervention.
And I maintain my view that, in its current architectural state, social media operates as a public menace. The issues of polarization, the rapid spread of disinformation, and the measurable decline in youth mental health are not merely growing pains or individual moral failures.
You see them as features, not bugs.
Exactly. They are the logical, intended outputs of engagement-driven algorithms and surveillance capitalism. Until the foundational business model of extracting human attention for profit is reformed, these platforms will continue to actively destabilize our institutions. We cannot rely on individual resilience to counter a multi-billion-dollar architecture that employs thousands of engineers specifically to exploit human psychology.
Yet, despite our opposing views on the fundamental nature of these platforms, there is a clear point of convergence here. Both of us acknowledge that the current paradigm, relying purely on voluntary self-regulation by tech monopolies, is dangerously insufficient.
On that, we are in total agreement.
The sheer scale of social media demands a new approach to accountability.
Agreed. Whether one views it as a sanctuary for free expression or an engine for societal harm, the user experience depends entirely on structural accountability. We both see algorithmic transparency not just as a corporate buzzword, but as an absolute baseline necessity for any future path forward. The era of the unchecked black box algorithm has to end.
It is perhaps the defining challenge of our era. Balancing the magnificent potential of free speech with the desperate need for structural accountability is a tightrope walk.
It certainly is.
Navigating this digital double-edged sword requires much deeper exploration into systemic frameworks, perhaps looking closely at the product liability mechanisms proposed in the Digital Services Act and debating where transparency ends and overreach begins. Because at the end of the day, we are no longer just laying cobblestones in a physical public square, we are wiring the nervous system of human society, and we have to decide if we are building a sanctuary for human expression or a trap.